The Boys Who Never Came Home, America's Lost Soldiers of World War II. Part 1. Letters from the Edge of the World. They were boys when they left, faces smooth, voices still uncertain, hearts full of promise. By the time their letters reached home, they had seen too much. This is where their story begins, not with the first shot fired, but with a quiet scratch of pen, somewhere on the edge of the world. They wrote because it was the only way to stay human. Every letter, every folded piece of paper that crossed the ocean carried not just words, but breath, heartbeat, memory. For many, those words would outlive them. When the United States entered the Second World War, over 16 million Americans would wear uniform. Most would return, but more than 400,000 never would. Their names would be carved in marble, but their lives, the laughter, the fear, the smell of rain on a battlefield morning, would be lost to silence. The letters remain. In one, dated November 1944, a 21-year-old farm boy from Kansas wrote home to his mother. "Don't worry, Ma. The chow's not bad, and we're holding fine. I keep thinking about the cornfields after harvest. Tell Dad I'll help next fall." He was killed 6 weeks later, near Bastogne, when a German shell struck his foxhole. The letter arrived 2 days after his mother received the telegram. There were thousands like him, fragments of a generation scattered across continents. They left behind classrooms and baseball fields, small-town churches and city corners, and stepped into a war they barely understood. They crossed the Atlantic on convoys shadowed by U-boats, slept in muddy fields, ate cold rations, and dreamed of home. For them, death did not come like in the movies, no heroic charge, no final salute. It came quietly, a sniper's shot, a sudden explosion, the indifferent silence of the sea. In the Pacific, another letter told a different kind of story. Private John Martinez, from El Paso, Texas, wrote from a jungle in the Philippines. "I don't know what day it is anymore. The rain never stops. We can't light fires. The smoke gives us away. I've got a buddy, Sam, who keeps a picture of his little girl. He shows it to everyone. Says he'll dance with her when he gets back. Funny, the things that keep us going." John never danced again. His unit was overrun near Luzon. He was 22. They were ordinary men placed in extraordinary hell. The newspapers called them heroes. But the letters revealed something more complex. There was fear, guilt, hope that clung to the smallest things. "Tell Mom not to send more socks. I don't think we'll be here long. They say the war might end soon. God, I hope so. I dreamt last night that I was home, sitting at the kitchen table. I could smell coffee. Then I woke up, and there was just mud." Each word, written under flickering candlelight or in the belly of a transport ship, was a bridge to a world that felt impossibly far away. The U.S. Army Postal Service moved more than 2 billion pieces of mail during the war. For every soldier, the letter was lifeline, connection, confession, and sometimes farewell. Officers knew morale depended on it. But what those letters carried could not be censored, the truth of what war does to men. One chaplain later wrote, "They still call themselves boys, but the light in their eyes that belonged to someone much older." He had buried dozens. Sometimes all that could be saved was a name tag, a photograph, a few folded papers sealed in a tin box. He called it the weight of memory. By 1943, the war machine was at full speed. Factories roared, ships crossed oceans, and the young men kept disappearing into history. Somewhere in Sicily, in Normandy, in the South Pacific, their voices fell silent. But in one of those letters, found years later in an attic trunk, a boy from Ohio wrote a line that outlived him. "If I don't come home, don't think too hard about it. Just tell them I was one of the lucky ones who got to see the world." He had seen too much of it. It's easy, decades later, to speak of numbers. 400,000 dead, 78,000 missing, 12,000 lost at sea. But those numbers were once names. Laughter, hands that built bonds, lips that kissed sweethearts on station platforms. Each death was a story that stopped mid-sentence. Back home, mothers kept their sons' rooms exactly as they left them. Some never stopped writing letters, as if words could still find their way across eternity. "My dearest son, I'm baking your favorite pie today. Your dog waits at the porch every morning. Your father says hello." The war ended, The letters did not. Those who survived carried the guilt of those who did not. They would walk through life with the weight of ghosts beside them, friends frozen forever at 19. They rarely spoke of it. When they did, their voices trembled, not from weakness, but from remembering. One veteran, decades later, said quietly, "We all came home with someone else's shadow." War changes everything. But for those who never came home, it froze time, held it still at the moment before death. Somewhere, a letter remained unopened. Somewhere else, a photograph faded slowly in the sun. That is where history ends, not in glory, but in the silence that follows it. In the next chapter, we step deeper inside the war, into the mud, the hunger, and the brotherhood that held men together. Before they died, before they disappeared, they lived 1,000 small moments that defined who they were. Next, Part 2, Brothers in the Mud. Would you like me to begin writing Part 2, Brothers in the Mud, 1,600 to 1,900 words, in the same cinematic, diary-infused third-person style now? Part 2, Brothers in the Mud. Before they became ghosts, they were brothers, bound not by blood, but by the unbreakable thread of survival, mud, rain, and the quiet understanding that tomorrow was never guaranteed. The soldiers of World War II learned quickly that war was not about glory. It was about endurance. Endurance of cold nights in foxholes, of hunger that gnawed at the bones, of fear that crept into every breath. In the hedgerows of France, in the jungles of New Guinea, and on the black sands of Iwo Jima, young Americans clung to each other, because there was nothing else to hold on to. They came from different places, coal towns in Pennsylvania, wheat farms in Kansas, city blocks in Chicago. But once the mud soaked their boots and the shells began to fall, those differences vanished. Private First Class William Harris, from Kentucky, once said in a letter to his sister, "Out here, nobody cares where you're from. You'd give your last bite of food to a man you didn't know a month ago, and he'd die for you without thinking twice." That was the strange magic of war. It stripped away everything but the core of humanity. In Normandy, after the D-Day landings, American troops pushed through the bocage, thick, tangled hedgerows that turned every field into a trap. Rain fell for days, turning the earth into a sucking swamp. Men slept sitting up in puddles, rifles resting across their knees. Mud became their home. It was in their boots, their blankets, their food, their souls. Corporal James Whitmore wrote in his journal, "I used to hate the rain back home. Now I pray for it. It hides us from the snipers. But when it stops, you can smell death again." The bond between soldiers was forged in that rain, an unspoken promise. I'll watch your back, and you'll watch mine. They called each other brother, even when they'd only known each other for days. It wasn't sentiment. It was necessity. When one man fell, another picked up his pack. When one froze under fire, another pulled him forward. They shared cigarettes, stories, and sometimes just silence. Because silence, in war, could mean life. In the Pacific, Marines battled not only the Japanese army but also the jungle itself. The air was thick with rotten mosquitoes, and the nights were alive with the whispers of movement. Sergeant Raymond Burke described it best. The jungle breathes. It listens. You can't see 20 feet ahead. You sleep with your rifle because you don't know what's out there, and then you realize you're what's out there. The fear never went away. It just changed shape. In Europe, it was a whine of mortars. In the Pacific, it was a rustle of leaves before dawn. Everywhere, it was the sound of a friend's name shouted into the dark, and no answer coming back. The letters home became shorter. At first, they were full of optimism and small jokes. By late 1944, they had become fragments. "Still here. Don't worry. Weather's bad. Tell Mom I'm fine. We lost Bill. Hard to talk about it." The men no longer wrote about victory. They wrote about endurance, getting through one more day, one more night. Food was rationed and cold. Sleep came in bursts of an hour or two. Rats, lice, and exhaustion were constant companions. But in the rare moments of rest, laughter still found a way in. They sang songs, played cards, teased each other about home. For a few minutes, they weren't soldiers, just boys again. Private Charles Dean remembered. "We made up a game. Whoever found a dry sock got to make up a story. You'd think we were crazy, but it kept us sane. The front was chaos, but the bond between men was order, a fragile piece of meaning in a meaningless world. There were moments of unbelievable courage, moments when men threw themselves over their friends to shield them from grenades, moments when wounded soldiers refused evacuation because another man was worse off, and there were moments of despair, when a soldier whispered his mother's name as he bled out, and the only witness was a trembling friend who would never forget that sound. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, winter tightened its grip on the Ardennes. Snow covered bodies and tracks alike. The cold was a living thing, merciless, bone-deep, indifferent. Men burned anything they could find for warmth, ration boxes, broken furniture, even pieces of their own gear. One GI wrote, "It's funny, the fire that saves you from freezing is made of the same stuff that could kill you tomorrow." The enemy was often invisible, and sometimes closer than expected. There were nights when American and German soldiers were separated by only a few yards of darkness, whispering prayers in their own languages to the same silent God. The bond of brotherhood became everything. They learned to tell each other's footsteps, each cough, each breath in the dark. When one was gone, the silence he left behind was unbearable. They made small altars out of helmets and dog tags. They spoke the names aloud so they wouldn't disappear. For some, friendship was the only thing that kept them from breaking. For others, it was a curse, because the more you love your brothers, the more there was to lose. One soldier later confessed, "You stop making friends. You just stand next to people, because everyone you talk to seems to die." Yet even in that hopelessness, something fierce endured, a shared belief that if they could just hold on, maybe one of them would live to tell the story. That's what they fought for, in the end. Not medals, not strategy, but each other. When the guns finally stopped, many of those brothers didn't come home. Some were buried in temporary graves under wooden crosses. Some vanished entirely, listed as missing in action, their last moments known only to the men who walked away. And those who did return never forgot. They carried the faces of their brothers in dreams, in nightmares, in the empty chairs at kitchen table for the rest of their lives. In one letter found years later, a survivor wrote to the mother of his fallen friend, "Your boy saved my life. I've tried to live it for both of us. Some nights I still hear him laughing. I hope you can forgive me for coming back when he didn't." There was no answer she could give. Some debts are too heavy for words. The war was far from over. Beyond the trenches and the foxholes waited a new kind of battle, one fought in the skies, on the seas, and inside the human heart. Part 3. Into the Fire, the Price of Victory. War teaches men how to survive, but never how to live again. Before they could dream a home, they had to walk through fire. By 1944, the war had entered its most brutal phase. The world had turned into a furnace, Europe in ruins, the Pacific burning, skies filled with the drone of bombers and the scream of shells. The men who had once written home about baseball and girls now wrote about fire and ash. Victory was near, they were told, but victory had a terrible appetite. In the ruins of Italy, American soldiers fought house to house. Every window could hide a sniper. Every church bell tower could be a death trap. Lieutenant Robert Ellison described it in a letter to his wife. "You can smell war before you see it. The air tastes like brick dust and burned oil. We move through towns on nothing but skeletons, walls still standing, but everything inside gone." Robert would die 3 weeks later when a mine detonated under his Jeep. The letter reached his wife a month after his burial. For those who lived, survival became a kind of madness. They stopped thinking of days, only moments. One more hill, one more breath, one more heartbeat. And yet, amid all this destruction, humanity flickered stubbornly. A soldier would share a chocolate bar with a starving child. Another would stop to bury an enemy dead, because even surrounded by hate, they remembered they were still human. In France, after the liberation of Paris, American troops saw civilians cheering, waving flags, kissing them on the streets. It was a moment of joy, but behind their smiles, the soldiers looked older than their years. They had seen too much to celebrate freely. One sergeant wrote in his diary, "The people are dancing, but I can still smell the gunpowder on my hands." The price of victory wasn't counted in territory or medals. It was counted in the faces of those who didn't make it. Every advance left behind a trail of helmets, rifles, and unspoken goodbyes. At night, the medics moved quietly among the wounded, whispering to them, holding their hands, pretending they would be all right. They learned to lie gently. "You'll be fine, son. Just hold on." Sometimes the boys believed them. Sometimes they didn't. In the Pacific, the battles grew darker still. Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Saipan, names that would become synonymous with blood. The Marines who landed on those beaches stepped into hell. The ground shook under artillery. The air was thick with smoke and screams. Private George Reynolds remembered. You didn't walk. You crawled. You tried to keep your head down, but the ground was alive with fire. The Japanese defenders fought to the death. There were no safe places, no rear lines, no mercy. Even the wounded could be carrying grenades. A medic later said, "We stopped seeing faces, just movements. You couldn't think about who you were killing. You'd go mad if you did." On Iwo Jima, the black volcanic ash clung to skin and blood alike. It soaked into the souls of the men who fought there. 19,000 Americans wounded, nearly 7,000 killed. But from that island rose a single image that would define the war. 6 Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi, a symbol of victory, captured in a single moment of defiance against the endless darkness. Yet even that moment came at a terrible cost. 3 of those 6 men would die within weeks. Victory, it seemed, always demanded payment. For every town liberated, 100 letters home began with, "We regret to inform you." For every flag raised, a mother's world fell apart. In Germany, as Allied forces advanced toward the Rhine, they began to see what the war had truly been about. At first, rumors, then photographs, then the camps. The soldiers walked through gates that read our Beat Mark Fry and saw mountains of shoes, hair, bones. They stood in silence, unable to comprehend what human beings had done to one another. One wrote simply, "If this is victory, I don't know what losing would look like." The liberation of the camps changed them forever. The young men who had left home to fight the bad guys returned as witnesses to something deeper, the abyss of humanity itself. As Germany collapsed, surrender came slowly, unevenly. One village at a time, one platoon after another, the guns began to fall silent. But the silence was haunted. The dead were everywhere, not just soldiers, but civilians, children, the innocent. The boys who survived found themselves wandering through ruins, asking questions no one could answer. Why him? Why not me? What did all of this mean? They were victors, yet hollow. Liberators, yet lost. The medals pinned to their chests felt cold. One veteran, decades later, put it this way: "We won the war. But I think it took something from all of us that we never got back." Back home, the newspapers printed headlines of triumph. Crowds cheered in Times Square. But the men who came back looked at those celebrations and felt only exhaustion. For every photograph of a sailor kissing a nurse, there was a silent hospital ward filled with men staring at the ceiling, wondering why they had lived. The price of victory wasn't paid in one day. It was paid over years, in nightmares, in missing limbs, in families that never received their sons back. The boys who never came home became memories. The ones who did come home became their keepers. There was no word for it then. PTSD hadn't been invented. They called it battle fatigue or nerves. But it was something deeper, the permanent echo of the battlefield in the human soul. Men would wake up sweating, shouting names that no one else remembered. They'd flinch at the sound of fireworks, or stare too long at the horizon, lost somewhere they could never return to. And yet, in the middle of all that pain, there was still a quiet pride. They had done what they were asked to do. They had fought for each other, for their country, for the hope that the world might someday be better. They carried that belief like a fragile flame, even as the years dimmed around them. "We did our job," one soldier wrote in his final journal entry. "We went into the fire. Some of us came back, but none of us came back the same." He was right. None of them did. The fires of war had burned across the earth, but for those still far from home, another journey awaited. A return not to glory, but to ghosts. Part 4. The Prison Without Walls. They had survived the front lines, the bombing raids, and the bitter cold of Europe. only to find themselves trapped in a different kind of cage, one without barbed wire, yet no less confining. For many American soldiers, the war didn't end when they came home. It only changed its shape. The telegrams had stopped coming. The parades were over. The bands had long gone silent. Across small towns in Kansas, Ohio, and Maine, the streets that once echoed with victory chants now carried the quiet shuffle of men who had returned from the unimaginable, alive, but not whole. They were called the lucky ones. But luck had nothing to do with it. Private James Rowe had been 23 when he stepped off the ship in 1945. His body was intact, but his eyes, they were different. They darted, never resting too long in one place. At night, his wife would wake to find him sitting by the window, cigarette trembling in his hand, staring out at the dark as if waiting for something, or someone, that never came. James wasn't unique. He was one of over 12 million Americans who had served, and among the countless who came back with invisible wounds. Back then, they didn't call it PTSD. They called it battle fatigue, or worse, weak nerves. The Army didn't have counselors, and society didn't have patience. Men were told to man up, get a job, and be grateful they'd made it home. But war is a way of clinging to a man. It seeps into his bones, follows him into his dreams, and whispers through the quiet moments when the world has moved on. The prison without walls. There were no fences this time, no guards, no searchlights. Yet for many veterans, post-war America felt like a vast confinement. Factories resumed production. Schools reopened, and a nation victorious turned its attention to prosperity. But not everyone could return to normal. The government had promised a land fit for heroes. The GI Bill did change lives. It sent millions to college and helped build a modern middle class. But it couldn't rebuild the broken trust between a soldier and his own mind. For men like James, the war had rewired something fundamental. Loud noises made him flinch. Crowded spaces suffocated him. When the 4th of July fireworks lit up the sky, he didn't see celebration. He saw artillery fire. Neighbors would wave, children would laugh, but he couldn't join them. The front might have been thousands of miles away, but in his head, it was still raging. The women who waited. If the men had been prisoners of war, their wives became prisoners of silence. Margaret Rowe had spent 3 years writing letters across an ocean, never knowing if her husband would receive them, or if he was even alive. Now he sat across from her at breakfast, but he might as well have been a ghost. She would speak softly, "James, it's time for church." He'd nod, distant. Sometimes he'd go, sometimes he wouldn't. In public, she smiled, but at night, she would sit on the edge of their bed and stare at the shadowed outline of the man she'd once known. "He came back," she wrote in her diary, "but he didn't return." For countless American families, this was a quiet aftermath of war. No medals, no speeches, just a slow unraveling of love in kitchens and small-town living rooms. The lost ones. Some veterans never found their way back at all. Homelessness among former soldiers became a national shame, though few spoke of it. In the late 1940s, park benches from Los Angeles to New York were filled with men who once stormed beaches and crossed battlefields. Many carried invisible scars, shell shock, trauma, survivor's guilt. Others were simply unable to fit into the fast-changing rhythm of peace. They were men who had once obeyed orders without hesitation, but now found themselves unable to take even one from a civilian boss. The Army had taught them how to fight, but not how to stop. In Chicago, a police report from 1948 described a veteran who had been arrested after breaking into a warehouse, claiming he was looking for his unit. When questioned, he wept. "They left me behind," he said. "They said we'd all go home together." The ghosts of Europe. For some, the haunting came not from memory, but from guilt. Many soldiers had seen the concentration camps. They'd seen the skeletal faces of the liberated, the piles of shoes, the mass graves. The war had not only tested their courage, it had tested their faith in humanity itself. Sergeant Alan Miller, a medic who helped free Dachau, never spoke of what he'd seen. His daughter would later recall how, every night, he would wash his hands again and again before bed. He'd scrub until his skin was raw, as though he could cleanse away something that had clung to him in that place. He told her once, "You can't imagine the smell. It wasn't just death, it was the end of innocence." The country that forgot. By the early 1950s, the nation had moved on. The new enemy was the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun, and the narrative of American victory demanded optimism. But not everyone could simply rewrite their past. Some veterans found solace in writing or art. Ernest Hemingway, himself a veteran, once said, "You never stop fighting the war, you just change weapons." Others found community with fellow soldiers. American Legion halls became sanctuaries, dimly lit rooms filled with smoke, beer, and stories too dark to tell elsewhere. Hey, men could laugh, cry, and remember without judgment. Still, most chose silence. Silence was the only way to keep the ghosts at bay. Letters never sent. Years later, when Margaret passed away, their daughter found a box in the attic. Inside were dozens of letters, unsent, unopened, never delivered. James had written them to his fallen friends. Each one began the same way. "I made it back." And each one ended with confession, "But I don't know what for." They were written in pencil, the handwriting uneven, as though the words themselves were trembling. In one, he described how he couldn't bear the sound of rain on the roof because it reminded him of artillery shell falling. In another, he wrote, "They told us we fought for peace. But peace is quiet, and quiet is when the memories come." The forgotten front. The war never truly ended for these men. It simply changed its terrain, from the trenches of Europe to the silent battlefields of the mind. In a way, America itself became another front, a country eager to move forward, blind to the invisible suffering it carried within its own borders. The victory parades were a kind of illusion, a celebration of survival, not understanding. And in the years that followed, while the economy boomed and the baby boom filled suburban streets, a quieter story was playing out behind closed doors. A story of men trapped in their own heads, and women waiting for the return of men who had already come home. The war was over, but for thousands, peace had become the cruelest test of all. And soon, as the world began to rebuild from the ashes, a new question would arise. How do you return home when home itself has changed beyond recognition? Part 5. The Home Front Rebuilt. They came back to a country bursting with promise. New cars, new homes, new beginnings. But beneath the glittering surface of America's post-war dream, something restless stirred. The men who had seen wars worse were now asked to build peace and to pretend they were whole. The war had ended, but its echo had not. Across the United States, train stations became reunion grounds. Soldiers stepped off, duffel bags slung over their shoulders, searching for the faces they'd memorized through faded photographs. Women clutched flowers. Children waved flags. Bands played, and for a moment, everything felt right. But homecoming, as it turned out, was not an ending. It was a beginning, and a complicated one. The Great Return. Between 1945 and 1946, nearly 8 million American servicemen came home. They flooded cities, towns, and rural crossroads alike, their uniforms soon replaced by factory overalls and press shirts. The war economy transformed almost overnight into a peacetime machine. President Truman promised jobs for all. The GI Bill, one of the most revolutionary acts in American history, offered tuition, housing loans, and business aid to veterans. For many, it was a second chance at life. Suburbs sprouted like spring wheat across the landscape. Rows of identical homes, white fences, and tidy lawns stretched toward the horizon. Men who had stormed the beaches of Normandy now mowed grass and painted shutters. But inside, the battle wasn't over. Behind the white picket fence, James Rowe, the same man who once sat staring out of his bedroom window at night, had moved his family into a modest home outside Chicago. It was his reward, his piece of the American dream. He worked at a local hardware store, smiled at customers, attended barbecues. From the outside, life looked perfect. But Margaret still saw the distance in his eyes, the hollow silence that filled their evenings. He rarely spoke of the war. When neighbors asked, he'd change the subject. Once, their young son brought home a toy soldier, waving it proudly. James took one look, went pale, and walked out to the porch. He sat there for hours, the cigarette burning down between his fingers, until the stars came out. A country trying to forget. America, too, was ready to move on. The newspapers that once ran war headlines now fill their pages with stories of growth and innovation. Television sets, automobiles, Hollywood glamour. There was a collective desire to bury the darkness of the 1940s under brightness of a new age. The trauma, the grief, the moral confusion. It didn't fit the narrative of victory. The government propaganda machine had painted the war as a noble crusade. But for those who had seen the aftermath, the camps, the rubble, the faces of children scavenging through ruins, the truth was far more complicated. They had fought to destroy evil, yes, but they had also learned that evil could exist anywhere, even in ordinary men. That knowledge was not easy to live with. The quiet revolution of women. While men rebuilt the world, women reshaped it. During the war, more than 6 million American women had entered the workforce. They had welded ships, assembled bombers, and kept the nation running while their husbands and brothers fought overseas. But now, they were being told to step back, to return to the kitchen, to domestic life. Rosie the Riveter became Rosie the housewife. Some accepted it, others did not. Margaret Rowe, like many women of her generation, found herself torn. She had worked as a clerk during the war, managing accounts with precision and pride. Now, her world had shrunk to grocery lists and dinner parties. At night, she'd look at her husband and wonder, if the world could change so quickly, why couldn't she? The seeds of discontent planted in those years would, decades later, blossom into the women's liberation movement. But in 1947, it was just a quiet ache shared by millions across the country. The hidden epidemic. Doctors began noticing something strange among returning soldiers. Tremors, sleeplessness, emotional withdrawal. They called it combat stress, nervous exhaustion, or post-war adjustment. No one called it trauma. In those years, men were expected to be stoic. Therapy was seen as weakness, so they drank instead. Bars became confessionals. Cigarettes replaced prayer, and the radio, always humming in the background, became the sound of escape, a voice that filled the silence they couldn't bear. Some men found solace in work. Others, like James, simply retreated inward. He wasn't violent. He wasn't cruel. He was just gone. The children of the war. For their sons and daughters, growing up in this new America was a strange experience. They lived in a land of plenty, yet were raised by parents marked by scarcity. Fathers who rarely spoke of the past. Mothers who smiled too often, as if to fill the silence. Many veterans struggled to connect with their children. How do you explain to a 5-year-old why you wake up screaming in the middle of the night? A generation grew up in the shadow of a war they never fought, but one that still defined their homes. These were the children who would later lead the movements of the 1960s, civil rights, peace, rebellion. They had inherited the restlessness of their parents, but none of the reasons for it. Building a better world. Yet from this uneasy peace, greatness also emerged. Veterans brought with them discipline, ingenuity, and a belief in progress. They built highways, universities, and corporations. They became engineers, scientists, teachers. Many used the GI Bill to study medicine, law, and architecture. Some even turned their pain into purpose. Alan Miller, the medic who could never wash the war off his hands, became a hospital volunteer. He would sit with dying patients, holding their hands, whispering, "You're safe now." When asked why he did it, he said, "Because no one should die alone. I saw too many who did." The unseen bridge. Amid the quiet struggle of readjustment, something remarkable happened. Former enemies became neighbors. German POWs who had worked on American farms during the war began writing letters back to their captors, thanking them for their kindness. Some even returned years later, immigrating permanently. The men who had once been called the enemy now became American citizens, business owners, and friends. It was one of the great paradoxes of the post-war world, that the people most transformed by the war were not always the ones who fought it, but those who had lived it from both sides of the fence. In this new world, mercy became as powerful as memory. The myth of normalcy. By the early 1950s, America had entered its golden age. But beneath the chrome and optimism, cracks were beginning to show. Veterans faced midlife crises before the term even existed. Divorce rates rose. Alcoholism crept into the suburbs. Behind every smiling family portrait, there was often an untold story, a man who couldn't sleep, a woman who couldn't dream, a child who couldn't understand. Peace, it turned out, was harder to sustain than war, because war gives you purpose. Peace gives you questions. A letter never sent. In 1953, James Rowe wrote one last letter. He never mailed it. Margaret found it after his death years later. They said the war was about freedom. Maybe it was. But freedom isn't just winning. It's learning how to live after you've lost so much. I hope someday someone will understand what it felt like to fight for peace and then to fight against yourself to keep it. He died quietly, surrounded by his family. The local paper ran a small obituary: beloved husband, father, veteran. Nothing more, but in a small wooden box under his bed lay the proof of another kind of victory: faded photographs of his unit, a map of France, and the letter he never sent. The world was healing, but the scars remained, etched not on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who had survived. And soon, as a new generation rose to question the meaning of war and peace, the forgotten veterans of the last great conflict would find their memories pulled back into the light once more. Next comes Part 6, The Reckoning of Memory, where the ghosts of World War II resurface amid new wars, protests, and the first whispers of understanding the wounds no one could see. Part 6, The Reckoning of Memory. For 20 years, they tried to forget. But memory has a way of breaking through silence, like the sound of a shell that never stops echoing. By the 1960s, the men who fought the last Great War found themselves living in a world that no longer understood them, or wanted to. The America they had built was changing. The soldiers who once stormed Normandy were now fathers and grandfathers, watching their sons march for civil rights, burn draft cards, and question the very meaning of patriotism. For them, it was like watching the country go mad. For their children, it was the first time the truth about their father's war began to surface. The reckoning had begun, not on the battlefield, but in the soul of a nation, the age of forgetting. In the 2 decades after 1945, silence became the language of the veterans. They worked, raised families, and filled photo albums with smiling faces, but rarely, if ever, spoke about the war. At Legion Halls and VFW posts, they gathered in smoke-filled rooms, trading jokes and stories that skimmed the surface. They could talk about rations, about the mud, about the taste of cold coffee, but not about the fear. Never about the fear. That silence was a kind of armor, protection from a world eager to move forward, and from memories too heavy to bear. But by the 1960s, cracks had begun to appear in that armor. Their children had grown up surrounded by myths of victory. The war movies, John Wayne charging through machine gun fire, the clean heroism of Hollywood, had replaced the real thing. America believed in its own legend. And then came Vietnam. The new war, the old ghosts. When the first American soldiers were sent to Vietnam, many World War II veterans felt an uneasy stirring. They watched the newsreels, jungles instead of beaches, helicopters instead of tanks, and saw the same young faces they once knew staring back. But this time, the nation was divided. The cheers that greeted the heroes of 1945 had turned into protests. College campuses erupted with anger. The word veteran no longer meant hero. It meant something to be pitied, or was blamed. For men like James Rowe's son, Michael, who came of age during this turmoil, the war stories his father never told suddenly became relevant again. He wanted to understand. But James had passed away years before. All that remained were his unsent letters, the fragment of a man who had never stopped fighting inside. Michael began to read them, line by line, searching for the father he never truly knew. They said the world would be better after this. One letter read, "But I wonder, better for who?" The son of a silent soldier was now part of a generation that refused to stay quiet. The return of the shadows. In 1968, the Veterans Administration released a quiet report, barely noticed by the public, on what it called delayed stress response. Doctors had begun seeing World War II veterans in their 50s and 60s suffering from recurring nightmares, insomnia, and sudden rage. Men who had lived normal lives for 2 decades were breaking down under the weight of memories they thought they had buried. It was as if the ghosts had simply waited. One physician wrote, "War trauma is like a time capsule buried deep in the mind. You can't destroy it. You can only postpone it." But society still didn't understand. There were no medals for endurance, no therapy for survival. The men who once saved the world now found themselves haunted by it. The ones who spoke. A few veterans broke the silence, not through speeches, but through art, writing, and film. Norman Mailer, Joseph Heller, Kurt Vonnegut, all veterans, all writing stories that stripped away the myth of glory. Catch-22, The Naked and the Dead, Slaughterhouse-Five, each a scream disguised as satire. Their words revealed what millions had hidden, that the war had been absurd, brutal, and profoundly human. Vonnegut, who survived the firebombing of Dresden, wrote, "There is nothing intelligent to say about a massacre." His book was banned in schools. Parents called it unpatriotic, but younger readers devoured it. For the first time, America was hearing what the veterans had never dared to say aloud, the healing that never came. By the 1970s, psychologists had a new term for what these men carried: post-traumatic stress disorder. It was a revelation that came too late for many. The men who had fought at Normandy, Okinawa, and Bastogne had already spent decades battling their demons in silence. But for a younger generation, the ones returning from Vietnam, it offered a lifeline. In counseling sessions across the country, veterans from two wars sat together, recognizing the same pain in each other's eyes. The gap of years, of generations, meant nothing. The war never cared how old you were. It only cared that you remembered. The war at home. For families, the reckoning was personal. Children began asking questions that parents had never answered. Old letters were found in drawers, medals tucked away in boxes. Margaret Rowe's daughter, now grown, began volunteering at a local VA hospital. She met men who reminded her of her father, men whose hands shook when they reached for a cup of coffee, who stared into space when someone dropped a tray. She began collecting their stories, not the ones about battles, but about the aftermath, the quiet endurance of those who came home only to find themselves lost in peace. One man told her, "We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought time, and time won." Memory as redemption. By the 1980s, America had begun to rediscover its veterans, not as symbols, but as people. Documentaries aired. Memorials rose. Books and interviews filled the shelves. It wasn't just history anymore. It was confession. At reunions, old men embraced, not as soldiers, but as survivors. They spoke of fear, of loss, of friendship. They cried in public for the first time in 40 years. For many, it was a kind of resurrection. The war hadn't ended when they came home. It ended when they finally spoke. And in their voices, a generation that had built the modern world found peace, not in forgetting, but in being remembered. The new America. The sons and daughters of the war survivors became historians, filmmakers, teachers. They turned their parents' pain into preservation. The museums that now stand in places like New Orleans and Washington, D.C., tell not just of victory, but of cost. They remind visitors that every flag raised on a battlefield casts a shadow that stretches across decades. And sometimes that shadow falls inside a family home where silence once lived. The last veterans. By the turn of the 21st century, the last voices of World War II were fading. Each obituary was a library burning. Those who remained, men in their 90s, frail but sharp-eyed, spoke softly in interviews, knowing time was short. One veteran, asked what he wanted to be remembered for, smiled and said, "Not for the fighting, for the coming home." That was the hardest part. The reckoning complete. The war had begun as a clash of nations. It ended as a confrontation with the human soul. For America, the reckoning was not about who had won or lost, but about what had been sacrificed in the process. The myth of the good war had been replaced by something more honest. The understanding that even righteous wars leave broken people behind. But in that truth lay a strange kind of grace. Because to remember suffering is to honor survival. And to speak of pain is to finally end its silence. They had fought the last great war of the century. But the peace they built would shape every one that followed. And as their stories faded into history, one question lingered. When the last witness is gone, who will remember the cost of forgetting?